Bodie and Doyle, guns out and Britain saved again. In my last video about the professionals, I talked about why the professionals mattered, why 1977 needed exactly this show at exactly that moment. But today, there's a detail buried in the series that should have stopped you in your tracks. The Professionals was built to fight terrorism in a decade that was completely defined by it, and yet, across 57 episodes, CI5 never once fought the single biggest terrorist threat in the country. So today, I want to find out what CI5 was actually for. Not the fictional brief, crimes too serious for the police, not serious enough for the army, the real one. What fear was this show quietly speaking to every week? And what happened decades later when someone tried to bring it back and discovered that fear had gone? December 1977. Britain is not in a good mood. Inflation has been eating wages alive. The unions and the government are locked in a fight that nobody seems to be able to win. And hanging over all of it is a word the news never seemed to stop saying: bombs. Between 1970 and 1994, the IRA's campaign killed around 1,800 people, and from 1973 onward, that campaign came to mainland Britain. The Provisional IRA deliberately targeted the British mainland, Parliament, Downing Street, Oxford Street, Harrods, to make ordinary Britons feel unsafe in their own capital. In February 1974, a bomb on a coach full of off-duty soldiers and their families killed 12 people, including 2 children. As a result, Parliament rushed through new anti-terror powers within days. This is the air Britain was breathing when the Professionals was launched, a country starting to wonder whether the ordinary police were equipped for this new kind of war. So enter CI5, fast, ruthless, answerable only to the Home Secretary. Bodie, ex-SAS, ex-mercenary. Doyle, ex-police, sharper, angrier, more willing to bend a rule. And Cowley, the old MI5 hand who needed men who didn't ask permission. Week after week, the fantasy was exactly what 1977 Britain needed. Someone to handle this. But stick with me, because the detail that quietly goes under the show's entire premise is coming. For a show built around domestic terrorism, the single most sustained terrorist threat on British soil throughout this entire run simply never turns up. Cowley's unit takes on hate groups, hired assassins, Cold War defectors, weapons smugglers, and even homegrown neo-Nazis, but never the organisation whose attacks were actually leading the news bulletins airing the other side of the show. So why was that? Well, partly deliberate caution. Broadcasters were acutely nervous about anything that could be read as taking a side on Northern Ireland, or worse, handing the IRA legitimacy. Drama that got too close had a habit of quietly disappearing before broadcast. So the Professionals did something clever, whether by design or necessity. It didn't remove the fear, it relocated it. It gave audiences terrorism, hostage situation, assassination plots, all a texture of what was actually frightening them, but rehoused it in invented enemies. You got the adrenaline of watching something to be defeated, without the show ever touching the one conflict that was unbearably real. The Professionals wasn't really about defeating a specific enemy. It was about the feeling of an enemy being defeated. A weekly reassurance, with a car chase thrown in. And once you notice that, the show's whole appeal starts to look slightly different, and a little bit darker. Underneath the bombs, there was a second fear, quieter, but just as corrosive. It was a growing sense that Britain's own institutions weren't coping. The Metropolitan Police spent the mid-1970s drowning in corruption scandals of its own. Senior Flying Squad and Obscene Publications Squad detectives were convicted of taking bribes from the very criminals they were supposed to be policing. Some of the most damaging convictions landed in 1977, the same year the Professionals went to air, and public trust cratered. Basic services were shutting down, rubbish was piling up, fire stations closed, hospitals were running on skeleton crews. For millions of people, the fear wasn't just that something dangerous was coming, it was that nobody in authority could stop it. CI5's founding logic is a direct answer to that mood, and a strikingly dark one for Saturday night television. The rule of law, as currently constituted, cannot protect you, so here are two men who will ignore it when they have to. That's not an accident of plotting, that's the pitch. It's the same instinct that made Dirty Harry a hit in America a few years earlier. The fantasy of a man who gets results precisely because he refuses to be bound by the rules. Britain, in its own clipped, Capri-driving way, was having the same conversation. It just dressed it up as entertainment instead of a morality play. Two fears stacked on top of one another, a threat outside and a creeping doubt inside. The Professionals ended in 1983, but the world that made it necessary didn't end with it. But television's appetite for that specific fantasy eventually did. In 1999, creator Brian Clemens tried to bring it back as CI5 The New Professionals. Edward Woodward in Cowley's chair, new agents, new era. On paper, a reasonable bet. But it only lasted one season, 13 episodes, and gone. Beyond the missing chemistry between the new cast, the real problem was the premise itself, because that had stopped making sense. The 1999 CI5 was rebuilt as an international task force. Britain, America, Japan, Germany, France. Corporate, global, and a bit sanitized. The original worked because it was hyper-local. One man, Cowley, reporting to the Home Secretary, protecting one anxious country in one anxious decade. And by 1999, that specific dread had started to lift. The Cold War was over. The IRA was in mid-peace process. The fear that had quietly powered the original, something is coming for us and the old rules can't stop it, simply didn't have the same grip anymore. Sky barely promoted it. Audiences shrugged. You can rebuild the cast, the car, even the theme music, but you can't manufacture a national mood. The Professionals wasn't really a show about CI5 fighting crime. It was Britain, in a genuinely frightened decade, telling itself a story about being protected, while carefully, deliberately, never looking directly at the thing it was actually most frightened of. It's why the show still holds up, not just as an action romp, but as a document of what the country couldn't quite say out loud in 1977, dressed up in a rolled neck sweater, a leather jacket, and a shoulder holster. And maybe that's why it could never be properly revived. Not because the formula stopped working, because the fear underneath the formula eventually did. If you haven't seen my first video on the Professionals, on why the show arrived exactly when Britain needed it, it'll be linked in the description, and this one is really the second half of that story. If you're the kind of person who wants British TV to be taken seriously, hit subscribe, and there's a lot more of this coming. Let me know in the comments what you think CI5 was really standing for, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye bye.